Fyodor Dostoyevsky is widely regarded as one of the greatest novelists in history. His work of fiction is so full of profound insights into human psychology, especially its interaction with various social and political structures of the modern world, that he is equally recognized as a psychologist and philosopher. His work questions how much we really know ourselves, what we truly want, and how we consider and achieve these things in the world, as well as the consequences of following false illusions and impossible ideals. His ideas and warnings about humanity, both individually and collectively, were not only ahead of his time, but are in many ways still unheeded warnings immensely relevant today. Dostoyevsky was born in Moscow, Russia, to a well-to-do Orthodox family. His father was a successful physician, and his family lived on the grounds of the hospital where his father worked. However, during his teenage years, his mother died of tuberculosis. While Dostoyevsky was in school studying to become an engineer, his father died under mysterious circumstances. It was reported and speculated that he was murdered by his own servants in an act of revenge against his abusive tendencies. The proximity of Dostoyevsky to the conditions of a hospital, his upbringing in a family of strong faith, and the early deaths of both parents, especially the possible murder of his father, likely shaped the early foundations of what would become his unique but tragic voice as a writer. After graduating from a military engineering institute, Dostoyevsky worked as an engineer. However, as a means to pursue his growing passion for literature and the humanities, he also began translating books as a side job. During this time, as his passion for literature grew more and more, he decided to give up his engineering career and focus solely on writing. In 1846, he published his first book, Poor People. This work immediately received commercial success and was praised favorably by literary critics of the time. It was considered the first Russian social novel. However, Dostoyevsky's subsequent works after this would struggle to find a similar level of success, and he soon found himself experimenting and failing as a writer, quickly falling into financial difficulties. Partially as a result of his financial situation, in 1847, Dostoyevsky became associated with a radical group of writers and intellectuals focused on utopian socialism. However, this association would soon lead to his arrest when the government persecuted those involved in such groups. In 1849, Dostoyevsky was sentenced to death as punishment. On December 22 of the same year, he found himself in front of the barrel of a gun pointed at his head, with the rest of his life now counted in minutes. While the officials maintained their aim and prepared to pull the trigger, suddenly, at the last moment, a message arrived, and Dostoyevsky was pardoned. It turned out that the execution was simulated, used simply as a psychological tactic to instill fear in the prisoners. After this, Dostoyevsky was sent to Siberia, where he was forced to perform grueling labor in horrible conditions for 4 years. In 1860, he returned from Siberia, but he did so as a very different man. He would soon begin to write again, but now his voice contained a new tone of pessimism, realism, and a highly perceptive understanding of the human psyche. He turned away from the utopian ideals of society and directed his focus towards spiritual and philosophical explorations. Over the next years, before he died of a lung disorder, Dostoyevsky would produce several successful masterpieces, many of which are still considered some of the greatest works of his time. One of the most prominent themes established in much of Dostoyevsky's work was his vision and evaluation of human suffering, more particularly the means by which humanity attempts to overcome and free itself from suffering, and the consequences of such attempts. This theme was especially significant in relation to a time when religious and spiritual anchors were severed, leaving individuals and societies to create and defend their worldviews through a growing drive of rationality and technology towards the ideal of perfect well-being. In Notes from Underground, published in, Dostoyevsky explores and critiques these modern Western ideals of rationality and technological progress as means to perfect happiness and goodness. In the novel, we follow a former official, an unnamed civilian often referred to as the Underground Man, through a series of diary entries. The man is deeply angry and unhappy, feeling contempt for others and the illusions they live under. He wants to make other people see the truth and acknowledge the same discontent and absurdity that he knows and feels in life. For Dostoyevsky, suffering is a fundamental principle of human life. It is impregnated in the blood. There is no life nor social or material condition for life that can exist without suffering. Thus, for Dostoyevsky, all the efforts and achievements of progress, both individually and collectively, can merely change the particular things from which we derive our suffering, but cannot eliminate our suffering in a comprehensive way. Man only counts his problems, he does not calculate his happiness, wrote Dostoyevsky. For him there never exists a social or material structure that frees humanity from unhappiness or suffering. Any goal of improving the world towards an idealistic and utopian version of itself is doomed to failure. Through The Underground Man, Dostoyevsky criticizes and warns against humanity's pursuit of such ideals, while operating within the increasingly prevalent perspectives of nihilism, utopianism, rationalism, and egoism. These perspectives culminate in the view that there is no inherent or transcendental meaning in life, and that actions and morals must be based on reason and knowledge, with self-interest as the driving force. However, Dostoyevsky argued that with a lack of religious faith, and humanity's deeply flawed and irrational nature, this worldview would become destructive. In the process of resolving suffering towards perfection, the solutions to old problems will inevitably create new problems that will require new solutions. The more grandiose the solutions, the more complex and perhaps destructive the new problems will be. This does not necessarily mean that efforts at technological or personal social improvement are useless or inherently bad, but rather that they are not capable of achieving what they often set out to achieve. If these efforts do not consider themselves within the limitations of the human condition, their constant movement can only serve to fan the flames of problems. In Notes from Underground, Dostoyevsky wrote, "Now I ask them, what can you expect from man? Since he is a being endowed with strange qualities, pour out all earthly blessings on him. Immerse him in a sea of happiness, so that on the surface, only bubbles of happiness can be seen. Give him economic prosperity, so that he has nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and take care of his family. Yet out of sheer ingratitude, out of sheer malice, man would play you a nasty prank. He would even risk his cakes and deliberately make himself the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, just to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal fantastic element. It is precisely these fantastic dreams and this vulgar madness that humanity desires for itself, as if it were necessary. For Dostoyevsky, humanity is irrational and incessantly desires a sense of individuality. Even if there were a life or perfect societies in which happiness could be easily achieved for everyone, humanity would rather go mad or destroy its perfect conditions than live as if it fit into a mechanical system. We think we want happiness, but we don't really want it. More and more we know that we could be happy, but we are not. Every time we find something to think about, complain about, or sabotage, our conscious mind seems to tell us that we want happiness and peace with perfect equality. Yet our whole being, our behavior, our history, shows us that we often want the opposite. Dostoyevsky's later masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, published in 1866, further explores the notion of self-knowledge, or the lack thereof. The novel focuses on a young former law student who lives in poverty, named Rodion Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov's mother and sister are sacrificing a lot to try to help Rodion's situation and facilitate his success. His sister even plans to marry a rich man to help him. However, all this disturbs and upsets him even more. Raskolnikov is also deeply affected by a nihilistic, rationalist, and atheistic vision of the world. Without the need to respond to religious or spiritual principles, Raskolnikov decides to kill and rob an evil moneylender. He rationalizes that the moneylender has acquired her wealth through exploitation, and that he, Raskolnikov, deserves the money more. He believes he can use the money to do good, helping his mother and sister, becoming a lawyer, and ultimately achieving greater good for society. Raskolnikov sees himself as a man of greatness and ruthlessness, someone who is above conventional moral codes, and thus justified in committing murder for the greater good. He proceeds to kill the pawnbroker, and then her half-sister when she accidentally witnesses the act. Throughout the rest of the novel, Raskolnikov finds himself tormented and filled with guilt and horror because of his actions. He realizes that he is not who he thought he was, not a man of ruthless power, but a tender and sensitive individual. Eventually, Raskolnikov turns himself in to the police to avoid going insane from guilt and torment. Through Raskolnikov, Dostoyevsky critiques the notions of reason and self-interest as comprehensive methods for determining morality and self-identity. Raskolnikov had every reason to do what he did, and yet his actions were wrong and caused him immense pain and suffering. As in Notes from Underground, Dostoyevsky once again criticizes the beliefs of nihilism, utilitarianism, rationalism, and egoism, beliefs that place all faith and relevance solely in the individual and base all efforts to maximize life and society on self-interest and rationality. Like Notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment focuses on the complexity of the human mind, and how we as observers and speakers aware of what we think we are often disconnected and inconsistent with who we truly are. Furthermore, our perception of others is often even further from the truth. Dostoyevsky not only shows how Raskolnikov has a completely inverted and false self-image, but also allows the reader to relate and empathize with him. Rather than simply showing how a bad character becomes bad, Dostoyevsky illustrates how a flawed character is not purely bad, and, in many ways, is very similar to us. Extremely confused and disoriented by the conflict of our internal psyche and our misunderstanding of that psyche. For all of us, the complex interaction between our conscious mind, unconscious mind, and the world outside of us is chaotic, confusing, contradictory, and perhaps impossible to truly understand. Those we fear or dislike may share a lot in common with us, and within us exists much of them as well. We do not know ourselves as well as we think. We pursue things we don't want and often fear what we truly desire. We are much less rational than we think, and exhibit a kind of madness every day and in every generation. Christianity and idealistic philosophies set us up for failure. Science cannot save us, and technology is not a means to escape our problems but simply an efficient transformation of them. Dostoyevsky himself believed all of this to be true, and on one level he was at least partly right. However, at the end of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is serving an 8-year sentence for his crime. The novel ends by hinting at the possibility that Raskolnikov's story suggests Dostoyevsky's belief that through suffering, faith, acceptance, compassion, and repentance, redemption is still possible. Although Dostoyevsky's work is largely dark and tragic, it also contains a sort of epilogue of redemption. In his novel The Idiot, published in 1869, Dostoyevsky reflects on some of his own personal experiences and ideals through the main character, Prince Myshkin. On one occasion, Prince Myshkin tells an anecdote about a man who recounts being arrested and sentenced to a mock execution by firing squad, an experience that almost exactly mirrors Dostoyevsky's own. Prince Myshkin says the man had about 5 minutes to live. Those 5 minutes seemed to him like endless wealth. He calculated the time, allotting 2 minutes to say goodbye to his comrades, 2 minutes to think about himself for the last time, and the final minute to look around for the last time. He was dying at the age of 27, healthy and strong. As he said goodbye to his comrades, he remembered asking a rather irrelevant question to one of them, and being very interested in the answer. After saying goodbye, he used the 2 minutes he had allotted for self-reflection to think as vividly as possible about his existence. He realized that in 3 minutes, he would no longer be himself or anything else. He wanted to solve everything in those 2 minutes. Nearby, a church with a golden dome shone in the bright sun. He looked at the dome with terrible fixity, and the rays that shone from it seemed to him to be his new nature. In 3 minutes, ignorance and hatred towards this new, unknown thing that would come were terrible. However, he said that nothing was more oppressive to him at that moment than the constant thought, what if I don't die? What if life comes back to me? He thought everything would be mine. I would turn every minute into an entire era and lose nothing. I would calculate every moment and not let anything go to waste. In the end, this thought became such a source of anger for him that he wished they would hurry up and shoot him. Through this anecdote, Dostoyevsky alludes to the idea that although life is often tragic, absolute purity and perfection are impossible, and suffering is fundamental. The conscious awareness of being moments away from losing everything is so overwhelmingly horrible that one would rather die than immerse oneself in the knowledge of how truly beautiful life is, and that it is on the verge of being lost forever.